We continue our coverage of yesterday's verdict in the case of former Minnesota police officer Derek Chauvin. A jury found him guilty on all charges in last year's killing of George Floyd. The 45-year-old former officer faces up to 40 years in prison when he's sentenced in 8 weeks. Joining us now, member of the House Judiciary Committee, Democratic Congresswoman Val Demings of Florida. She was formerly the chief of Orlando's police department, the first woman to hold that position. Former Senator and prosecutor Claire McCaskill is back with us as well. I guess for my first question, Val, is, your thoughts when the verdict was read, what this means, and what your hopes are for legislation down the road.
Well, let me say this. It's been a tough year. It's been a year of grieving. It's been a year of pain. We're all exhausted. I think people around the nation and around the world, quite frankly, were waiting on this verdict. And so when the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, I know it was a sigh of relief for people around the nation. I do believe, I've heard a lot of discussion about whether justice was served or not. I do believe that justice prevailed on yesterday. Justice is certainly bigger than one act or one case. We understand that. But we saw the community come together. We saw the criminal justice system at work, which certainly has its flaws. But we saw bystanders, from a 9-year-old girl to an off-duty paramedic to others, one by one, testifying in the courtroom. We saw an attorney general who certainly was serious about putting a great team together to prosecute this case. We know that Derek Chauvin certainly had his day in court. I know the American people were asked, the jurors in particular were asked to not believe their eyes or ears. But obviously, in this case, the evidence was so overwhelming. The verdict was a great step in the right direction, although, Mika, we still have a tremendous amount of work to do.
I want to talk about that work, but just to point out to put a frame around those bystanders that were on the witness stand, that were in that video, many of them so disturbed by what they were seeing and so kind of like, oh, here we go again, like just helpless, absolutely helpless. And good people who never imagined they would be in the spotlight like this. And it was real validation for them, I can imagine. But the work that needs to be done, I feel like it's on so many levels. And I want to ask you about legislation that you would like to see happen, that you think is necessary, but also to point out, as a former police chief, I'm sure you have seen many wonderful cops in your career. And, there's a fine line here in terms of morale as well, to make sure that we see the good cops too.
I think it is so important to remember, as we deal with this tragedy and forge a path forward, it's important to remember that there are hundreds of thousands of good men and women who put on the badge every day in the uniform and go out and keep their communities safe. This is about holding bad cops accountable. And Mika, over the last year, I have looked at this situation through my social worker eyes and my law enforcement eyes. In terms of law enforcement, we do have the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that is there. Of course, it passed the House. It is now in the Senate. We are certainly hoping that the Senate will take this opportunity to do their part. Attorney General Ellison said, now it's in your hands. That's all of our hands. And so this is an opportunity for the Senate to step up to the plate, lay politics aside. We pray that they will, and pass this legislation. But it's just the beginning. We also, as we talk about holding America to its promise, we talk about systemic racism in law enforcement, perhaps. We also need to hold America to its promise in all systems. And from my social worker hat, we need to get serious about dealing with some of the social ills, the quality of life issues that plague communities in the first place, like poverty, high unemployment, low wages, substandard education, substandard housing, those issues that we have been talking about for decades, but seem to have never really done anything substantive to address them. So while we hold law enforcement accountable, and we will, we also need to deal with those quality of life issues that cause decay in communities in the first place. We need to come together as a community and get this done. If we have the political will to do it, I believe that we can do anything that we want to do.
Congresswoman, it's Willie Geist. It's great to see you this morning. You famously wrote an op-ed just a few days after the death of George Floyd that we can now call the murder of George Floyd. In the Washington Post headline, "My fellow brothers and sisters in blue, what the hell are you doing?" And you laid out all the reasons why what happened in Minnesota was wrong and what needed to change. I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about what you saw in that courtroom over the last 3 weeks, which was to say a chief of police coming out and condemning former Officer Chauvin, say we don't teach that. That's not our practice. That's not our policy. He violated. To hear his supervisor at the time come out and condemn him, to hear use of force experts come out and condemn him, to hear the 911 operator at the beginning all say, I saw this on a monitor. It looked bad. I told my supervisor. What does it mean to have those officers come out and confront something that they plainly saw as wrong?
You know, Willie, when I wrote the op-ed, I did so as a member of a community that I love, and also as a member of a profession that I love, because we were able to do a lot of good things. Every day was not perfect. But when I think about law enforcement, and as I said earlier, the hundreds of thousands of good men and women who do the job, what happened clearly with George Floyd should not have happened. It was brutal, it was senseless, and now it's been confirmed, although I said it a year ago, that it was murder. You know, some people say, what's going to change, or things going to change? Well, they already have, and you talked about it. In this trial, not only did we see bystanders who, you know, ordinary people who, by the way, did not have to get involved. They could have walked away, but instead, we heard them on the stand talk about they wish they could have done more. But we also saw the police chief. I mean, we all can ask ourselves, how many times have we seen the police chief come in and say, that's not our policy, nor is it our ethics or our values. We saw Derek Chauvin's lieutenant come in and say, that's not our policy. But then we saw the training officer come in and say, we don't teach that technique at this police department. I believe their testimony, along with the testimony of all of the witnesses, was compelling, it was convincing, and we saw the very strong, very powerful verdict, guilty on all charges on yesterday.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.